Hello and welcome to the Federal. I am Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay and you are watching Off the Beaten Track, a program in which we do not talk about just the news of the day, what is making the headline, but we will also talk about various issues which actually go up to making the headline, the background story to it. So we will essentially start talking about the recent amendment made to the IT amendment rules by the Government of India. The actual wordage is a mouthful, so it will come probably scrolled right at the bottom or the top of our program. But for our common discussion purposes, we are calling it the IT rules of 2023. Now, this actually introduces or rather reintroduces the idea of censorship, what we are going to be able to read or hear on social media and on intermediaries. That is, those vehicles, those platforms which carry the news. Talking to me is going to be Apar Gupta, who is a leading lawyer of India, who's actually worked essentially on technology and issues of democracy. He is also the non-executive director of the Internet Freedom Foundation, and he writes regularly on democracy and technology also. So welcome to the program, Apar. It's really a privilege to talk to you. I have been wanting to interact with you for a long time, been reading and listening to you for several years, in fact, I would say. Youthful voice, but a very important voice for the future. Apar, you recently wrote an article in the Indian Express where the headline actually says it all. Ministry of Truth. New IT rules create power of censorship. Now, our generation is the one which actually grew up on the censorship of the emergency era. The censorship that is indicated in your article in the slug line is actually a censorship of a completely different kind, a different dimension. Let me quote you from this article. You say that the IT rules 2023 do not define what constitutes fake or false or misleading information, nor do they specify the qualifications or hearing process for a fact-check unit. It's quite a serious statement, in the sense that you are actually making a statement on a very important move of the Government of India. I would like for you to elaborate and try to explain to the viewers as to what exactly is this amendment rule which has come about, how does it modify the existing rule which came 2 years ago in 21, and what really it means in terms of the people who are watching us. False, fake, or misleading. Would somebody even say that the conversation that we are having is misleading, so it cannot be carried on any of the intermediary platforms?
Thank you so much, Nilanjan, for inviting me for this interaction today. The article which I wrote in the Indian Express is titled as Ministry of Truth, which takes its title inspiring from Orwell's iconic 1984, where the single-party state of Oceania is actually having a state-mandated language called Newspeak. And there's a minor character in that novel called Sim, S-Y-M-E, who's a lexologist who's making a new version of Newspeak. You have to have a dictionary for a prescribed language, and there will be only one dictionary. And he says that the dictionary is being made to, in fact, make citizens or people, not unpeople, but people who are citizens, actually prevent thought crimes. So language itself provides a boundary of imagination. And the thing to notice here, the tyrannical state thinks that the dictionary and the language that it provides actually is for the benefit of the people. It is not an oppressor. This is important for us to understand when we think about the intention of the government. I think a government is most oppressive when it is completely oblivious to its own draconian nature. And this is very important for us to understand. Now I'll come and explain how is this power draconian.
Right.
The very basis of the word draconian is disproportionate. It is when a person is sentenced to death for the theft of a cabbage. Okay.
Right.
So if you look at what has been done a system of censorship has been enforced where the government will now classify what is fake, false, or misleading by a unit of the central government with respect to business of the central government.
Right.
One, the timing. The timing is approximately 1 year before the general election. Two, it is through an executive notification where the unit, fact check unit of the central government does not exist right now. Its qualification, criteria, etc. is not prescribed. It is the central government checking what is fake, false, or misleading about the central government, a judge in its own case.
Right.
There is no mention of the criteria, which is the definitional boundary of what is fake, false, or misleading. For the government will determine it as per its own standards. The public disclosure of these determinations is also not provided. Now, if we look at why this is being done today, it comes across as essentially something which was also present during the emergency, but it is being done through a technical design, and this is the distinction we need to understand. Whereas in the emergency, you needed to take approvals and submit copies at certain instances, and there were censorship bureaus. What has been done today is essentially a power which has been created with the central government, where if it can say that this conversation which we are having is fake, false, or misleading without defining it by itself, without publicly disclosing the order, it can do so by transmitting it to YouTube, where this conversation may be hosted, Twitter,
Yes,
where this conversation may be shared, and at all those places, it will disappear. In fact, if you host this on your own website itself, our internet service provider may also block it. And this will be done without any transparency. I would say this is a much more efficient system of censorship and actually an improvement on the emergency by the facility of digital technologies.
Well, as you said, a tyrannical regime can actually use technology to harness tyranny better. That is possibly what is happening. When you were actually talking about the fact check unit and the fact that it is going to be a department of the government, which is actually going to be deciding what is fake, false, or misleading, and then pronouncing the judgment and then take the action. And you also referred to emergency. So I was reminded, like it happens in a case of large number of Indians, I was reminded of poetry, and that too poetry written during the emergency by one of the leading voices of that time. 2 lines says it all. कि उन्हीं का शहर, वही मुंसिफ, वही मुद्दई, मुझे यकीन था यारों, कसूर मेरा ही निकलेगा. It was their city, it was their courts, and everything was theirs. I was convinced right from the beginning that I would be the one who would be pronounced guilty. That is what the Shair said. Now, this is possibly what is exactly happening. Now, you also point out that Article 19, Clause 2 pointed out that it does not contain the phrase fake or false or misleading. So it is actually, you're creating a new concept within the existing constitution. How would you explain it to, you are a person who's an expert in law. Now, what exactly is the jugglery which is being done? That nothing is being done to tamper with the basic constitutional rights of the citizens, but then within that it is being hollowed out, or certain things are being introduced or added.
So, Nilanjan, I'll disclose that I am a big fan of Mahatma Gandhi, and when I went to the ashram, the first rule of the ashram is Satya, that truth. Right. And while I think that objective truth is a very high moral standard, when you creep it into law and make it a form of censorship, bad things occur. And I'll explain why. One, it is in human nature to lie. And I've written another op-ed on it, which is in defense of liars. And we call it a white lie sometimes. Sometimes we just say something which is inaccurate in our personal conduct quite often, in a social media conversation quite often, which may be a conversation between two private individuals. Now, of course, this is within outside the ambit of the law because it only relates to the business of the central government. But let me now come to the second part, which is any inaccuracy about the central government quite often occurs due to, as has been explained by the Supreme Court, when it quoted the Sullivan case in R. Rajagopal, is that the government itself is not transparent. So journalists, RTI activists, people who seek information from it, quite often in a longer article may contain one or two small inaccuracies. It may be a date accuracy. Some person who may be present there may not be present. And by itself, the substantive basis of the reporting may be correct, but one or two facts may be factually incorrect, which is why newspapers carry with responsibility also corrections, which has been a standard in journalism. Now, what happens under this law? And the third thing I'd just like to mention is, who is determining truth?
Right. The government
is discovered when there are multiple people who work on the same objective assessment and they also disagree, and then we come to a consensus what is truth, what is accurate. In a sense, you need to permit scrutiny and then only truth emerges. And you cannot do it when the interested party, which is to be checked by a reporter, a journalist, itself becomes the judge of what is being stated as inaccurate or accurate, or the proportionality of that inaccuracy itself in a report. And then with that, carrying a censorial power. Now, I would say the government would be okay in terms of making a fact-check unit and putting out what is accurate and inaccurate if it would have clear guidelines on how it actually assesses what touches upon issues of public interest. But this is a censorial power. The minute the government does it, everyone needs to block it and remove it by itself, which is why I will say again that this is a draconian power, because the government is acting as a judge by itself, is less than transparent about its business. There is a nature of inaccuracy, which is inevitable with reporting. In fact, the PIB fact-check unit in the same Indian Express article I've noted itself has made inaccurate statements. Imagine the government's own fact-check unit with all its power, with all its resources, also doing a fact-check which is incorrect about its own self and being contradicted by another.
And I think you also point out that within a day, the government's another wing comes and issues a clarification that no, the fact-check unit was wrong.
And this is not an isolated instance. This happens regularly. And I would say this does not shame the government or the PIB fact-check. It focuses more public scrutiny on the PIB fact-check to improve its standards. Why are these mistakes taking place? But one cannot do that if the PIB fact-check is the final verdict, which is a decision in secrecy, not disclosed to the public, without an opportunity of appeal, and results in an immediate takedown of a press report. And this is the very definition of what is an Orwellian society, what is a tyrannical state, which is why it's important for us to pause and consider the moment we are at right now.
Let me ask you, you are talking about fact check. My sense of the use of fact check as a major vocation in India since 2014. I'm using the word vocation because there is definitely one section of journalists who are actually doing nothing but fact checking. It essentially started from outside the government. Am I correct in my understanding?
Yes,
that essentially it started to fact check all the very wrong, false claims being made by various people within the government and various other senior leaders within the ruling party and its allies. So they were the ones who were making all kinds of false allegations, false claims, and to go and actually scrutinize those, that an entire genre of journalism developed called fact-checking. Slowly, by and large, every top media organization started having their own fact-check units. But still, we don't know that what happened to Mohammed Zubair a few months ago, who was possibly among the early fact-checking companies, just a website created only for the sake of alt news, I'm talking about, for essentially fact-checking purposes. So, so obviously, I understand that my understanding is correct.
I'd like to, and Nilanjan, I'd just like to mention one thing. Beyond fact-checking, there is also a tendency to criminalize opinion, commentary, cultural motifs. Just look at what's happened a week back, in which two rappers who may be, for younger generation, almost like poets, given that the lyrics do rhyme, have been arrested in Maharashtra for songs about critical of the Eknath Shinde-led government. So that's Raj and Umesh Khade, and it's individual instances. They've been charged under obscenity and threatening public order, etc. So I would say that we need to consider the moment we are at. This comes when Punjab has shut down the internet, rolling for 5 days in several places. There has been website blocking of BBC Punjabi and journalist accounts on Twitter. Accounts, not individual tweets, actual accounts. Then Ram Navami celebrations have taken place, which have resulted in certain communal clashes, leading to internet shutdowns in Bengal and Bihar. And subsequent to that, this rule has come in. India is going through a process which I would only very politely term as a social churn, in a sense. And it is putting a large recasting of how technology is also playing a part in it. I would want people to understand that how these governance systems, how our law and technology is also a very active part of the censorial apparatus of the state, not only the union government, but the entire state.
Right. Now, let me try to understand the timeline of this IT, rules amendment, which have been just issued. When does it really become law? And then does it also happen with retrospective effect? Would there be ever a situation where your article in the Indian Express may be labeled as misleading, and then a stricture is issued that no intermediary can carry that, which means that it is not going to be available through normal search engines? The other websites, especially the Indian Express, would possibly continue to have it at grave risk. What is the timeline like?
So the notification on the amendments was made on April 6th.
6th of April.
Yeah. And subsequent to that, the fact check unit by the central government also needs to be created and notified. As per a statement by the Minister of State, Mr. Rajiv Chandrasekhar, in the press, it would have been done in 10 to 15 days when public criticism started, and he, in his interactions with the press around April 7th and 8th, stated that it will be done in 10 to 15 days, and we will take care of all concerns when we set this up. We don't have these details of defining what is fake and etc. etc.
No definitions are being given.
Yeah. So those rules don't have those details, but we'll come out with the details later when we create this unit. So 10 to 15 days. I would imagine that its enforcement may not actively start on what are termed as mainstream news platforms immediately. And the growth of censorship always occurs incrementally. So it happens slowly and then happens all of a sudden. So the first direct fact checks which will be done will be of independent journalists, which will be working and bringing narratives from smaller parts of India where they pose a challenge to the union government or to public officials, such as the Prime Minister or people who are in power. And those kind of censorship orders will be passed prior to state and general elections, where the damage will be the highest. So the risk will be the least to the censorship, and the benefit will be the greatest. And I would like people to understand this is not because the state is evil in terms of its design. This is the natural progression of unchecked power when you don't have institutions, when you don't have rule of law systems in place. This is the natural outcome.
You were talking about that it is not going to, the rule is not going to immediately start targeting major national media houses. Once again, I could not actually not remember something, again, a leaf from the pages of emergency after emergency was lifted, and when the Janata Party government was in power, and Mr. Lal Krishna Advani, who's been greatly responsible for bringing the BJP to where it is now, he made this statement, which is possibly one of the most iconic statements ever made about journalism and the media. He talked about the journalists during emergency, and he said that they were asked to bend and they crawled. So that is what happened during emergency, that only a handful of journalists actually protested. They shut down their shops. So we really do not know that how long, how many...
Nilanjan, in Arun Shoury's first collected set of writings, it's published in a book called Symptoms of Fascism. The first chapter in that is published from seminar, and I would urge people to read it who's watching it, because the viewers of this may like it. And it's a lament on why do Indians do not speak up. And if you read it today, you will be surprised and you will say that somebody has written it today if you just hide the name of the author. The second thing is, in today's time, the dispensation is not asking journalists to bend.
Not right.
It is asking journalists. It's asking journalists to jump, and the journalist response is how high. Okay, so it's not as if journalists are only crawling in a sense, or journalism is crawling. There's a sense of ecstatic welcoming of these kind of internet censorship moves quite often, which we have also seen beyond what's happened much more recently, where the leading newspapers have put out editorials. Because, there's also a large level of support for web censorship today. If you look at the same broad conversations which have been taken place for prior to 2 to 3 years, in fact, the leading national publishers quite often were saying the internet poses a challenge to journalism in terms of not only revenue, but also in terms of authenticity of information. So there has been a contribution which needs to be recognized. In fact, the IT rules were amended in 2021, first on February 25th. And parts of
online media platforms were brought into it.
Yes, exactly. Digital news media platforms were also brought within its ambit, and certain rules which were in place on traditional print media, such as a code of ethics, etc., were also put in place for digital news media platforms.
Exactly.
The people who were running newspapers and television channels were saying, well, this is really good because it levels the playing field. And I was having a conversation with many of them, and I was explaining, well, the same rules are made to actually restrict your press freedom. Why don't you think about it from the possibility of your digital ventures also being placed under those same limitations, and your opportunity to conduct journalism being restricted? But I would also like to indicate there is a level of shared responsibility which needs to be recognized on how the law has developed to where it has developed today.
Right. Now, moving on from here, from one point which you said, while you were speaking, in response to the previous question, you talked about why is there not enough protest or is enough awareness within society. This reminds me of the release of the report on the state of surveillance in India by this very important organization called Common Cause, which is tied up with Lok Niti, which has been in the area of social science research for a large number of years. You were one of the speakers there. I heard you also there. A very important point which came out is that a large number of people do not seem to be really worried about Big Brother watching from behind the shoulder all the time. I'm just using a figurative word for the word surveillance. Till the time there isn't a pushback, we are not trying to understand as a journalist, you have dealt with this issue, that why is there no pushback from the people? Why aren't they really bothered that every moment of their digital existence is being followed and tracked? Why aren't people really bothered and concerned about it?
So the survey is really interesting. This report,
Yes.
which has been done by Common Cause, CSDS, Lokniti, it's really
Definitely.
interesting. And I really follow Lokniti's reports because uh, it's the kind of data gathering which helps you check your biases. For instance, they did a
Right.
report on the state elections in UP or popularity of the government there. And they came to the understanding that a majority of the people blame the government for mishandling COVID, but the popularity of the chief minister and the prime minister increased because they don't attribute the
Right.
faults of the government to the people who are primarily responsible for the functioning of the government. So human beings are not rational in that sense. There's a larger sense of how people approach these issues. Now, with respect to privacy surveillance, I would state if you look at the state-based surveys, it shows that people in Gujarat are the ones who support it the most.
Right.
But they're also the people who fear being arrested for posting their social and political opinions online for threat of legal action. So
Right.
the person who wants more surveillance is also the person who's more scared, maybe. The people who, from the states, state-based survey, who support it the least are Tamil Nadu and Kerala. The people who really are opposed to it are from Punjab.
Right.
Now, this should show you something and this should tell you a bigger story. And I think why are people, Indians per se, not appreciating the dangers of these digital systems' impact on their lives? The first thing, I think it's new. I think their understanding of privacy is new. If people are still not in India very aware about what is freedom of speech and expression, how can we expect them to know more about privacy? Secondly, there's a large socio-economic basis to our society, which is based on gender, identity, and caste, which
Right.
quite often conflicts with our constitutional rights, which includes
Right.
freedom of speech and privacy. We need to understand it. And social norms and values are sometimes always stronger than legal systems by itself. The third is that we lack aspirational politicians today who not only channelizes the deepest fears, doubts of people, but actually pose aspirational, actually build constituencies of aspirational politics, that we can be better as human beings. We can have a place, human rights is something which is to the benefit of you and me, rather than something which is part of a new vocabulary of tukde tukde gang, anti-national, etc. So I think we have failed to do a lot of these things. There are huge challenges around this. But what is also comforting is that people who have suffered increased amounts of surveillance do fear it, do not support it. And that's learnings from Punjab. People who do not fear posting their social and political opinions online are because the law and order in their states permits them to be acting in a way where the social values also permit them to have certain statements without fear of legal prosecution. That's Kerala and Tamil Nadu. So I think change is possible, and India is not it's a very large country in the sense and different regions, different social sensibilities, and different rule of law frameworks in terms of a citizen-state interaction. So the report is really interesting. I think it should continue year by year, and maybe we'll get to see in a decade or more that what are the changes in data. That's something which is of greater interest to me.
So what you are basically saying, when we look at the entire scenario of surveillance in terms of, controlling what information is out there to be able to reach out, that things are bad, but it is not all that bad, that there are possibilities of a pushback. There is some kind of an awareness building up at some parts of the country among certain demographic groups, maybe more than others. All that you see that happening, and some kind of a pushback in the coming years.
Yes, certain forms of privacy are already very much valued by people. People would like to have the right to correction of their official records. And this is a right which is provided by privacy. Not only do you get to surveil or keep the information which I consent to, but then you have to keep it accurately. You have to delete it when the purpose is over. People do want that. People quite often do not want to share their phone numbers at shops. What does that show?
Right.
People are concerned about data breaches which take place,
Aadhaar
which
number.
may pose threats in terms of their banking records, much more tangible injuries. And quite often now, people who are experienced in metropolitan cities, when they are asked that, hi, I'm speaking from this and this company, and we want this data, etc., they ask the other person to prove their identity before providing that information. I think some care in consumer information privacy is coming in place. Also, privacy is a broader concept.
And people are also aware of online scams now. You have had serials on OTT which have, if not been watched by people, at least they have heard about these stories which circulate on the social media in various groups. So that is what. So I cannot, trying to conclude it, and while thanking you for this wonderful discussion, but I want to use that half glass, empty and full analogy once again. It is actually not half glass water and half glass air, as the Prime Minister said very famously in 2013-14 in one of the Delhi University colleges. But it is actually, if not half, maybe 1/3 full. And let us hope, that this pushback is only going to increase. Thank you very much, Abhar Gupta, for coming and speaking on a very important issue of censorship and the growing fear and the big brother watching all the time and how the people are responding to it. Thank you very much.
Subscribe to the Federal's YouTube page for more interesting updates.